Look back at the late 19th century in India, and you might expect a subcontinent in unified rebellion against the British Crown. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated. When the Indian National Congress formed in 1885, its members weren't plotting a violent overthrow. They were seeking specific concessions. They wanted the right to sit for the civil service exams and a minor voice in local administration. Early leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji believed in the concept of British justice. He and many of his peers operated under the assumption that if they presented logical, polite arguments, the empire would recognize them as equal citizens. But this strategy of polite reform held a fatal flaw. The British Raj was never designed to be an equal partnership. The system relied on India remaining submissive to fuel a much larger machine. This map breaks down the core economic loop of the British Raj. The empire extracted cheap raw materials, like cotton, from Indian soil. Those materials were shipped to England for processing, and then the finished, manufactured goods were sold right back to the Indian public at inflated prices. To keep this loop running profitably, the British destroyed India's indigenous textile industry. They flooded the domestic market to ensure local weavers could never compete. Contrast that domestic devastation with the scene back in the United Kingdom. Massive textile mills in Lancashire generated industrial wealth, subsidized by this captive overseas market. Because Britain's prosperity relied on this extraction cycle, granting Indians real political power would have derailed their economy. Real representation was never on the table. The illusion of a benevolent empire cracked in 1905. To suppress rising political awareness in the East, the British partitioned the province of Bengal, separating Hindu and Muslim populations to divide and rule. This manipulation outraged the public and sidelined the moderates. Radical leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak stepped forward, declaring that self-rule was no longer a privilege to be requested, but a birthright to be claimed. The response was the Swadeshi movement. Instead of writing petitions, Indians organized a unified boycott of British goods. They spun their own cloth and focused on indigenous industries to hit the empire's economic engine. The partition of Bengal proved that colonial authorities would sabotage Indian unity to maintain control. In response, the nationalist movement evolved from making polite requests to waging organized economic warfare. A decade later, World War I tested that relationship further. India provided a massive influx of troops, money, and resources to the Allied war effort, doing so with the expectation that their loyalty would be rewarded with self-rule. Instead of granting those freedoms, the British government passed the Rowlatt Act immediately after the war. This law permitted the detention of Indian citizens without trial. When peaceful protests erupted across the Punjab to oppose the act, the colonial military responded with massive force, culminating in the horrific Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where hundreds of unarmed civilians were gunned down in an enclosed courtyard. That post-war betrayal destroyed the remaining psychological tie between the rulers and the ruled. The British Raj lost its moral authority in the eyes of the Indian public. In this climate of severe distrust, Mahatma Gandhi introduced a completely new strategy. He focused on mass mobilization, organizing millions across different classes, castes, and religions into a unified force of non-violent civil disobedience. Through the 1920s, a psychological shift took hold. Public defiance of British commissions, courts, and taxes became a routine part of daily life. The fear of colonial authority began to evaporate. By the time of the 1929 Lahore session, a new generation of leaders, including Jawaharlal Nehru, formalized this shift. They were done negotiating for minor concessions, abandoning the quest for dominion status within the empire. Instead, they issued a new demand, Purna Swaraj. This was a call for complete and total sovereignty from Great Britain. By adopting Purna Swaraj, the independence movement finalized its transition. What began as a reformist political campaign was now a fight to build an independent nation. The breaking point arrived in 1939. Without consulting a single elected Indian representative, the British Viceroy unilaterally declared India's entrance into World War II. Refusing to be dragged into another global conflict without sovereignty, the Congress launched the Quit India movement in 1942. Gandhi issued a stark instruction to the masses: do or die. triggering a civilian uprising across the subcontinent. Resistance fractured into multiple fronts. Leaders like Subhas Chandra Bose split from the nonviolent approach, allied with Axis powers, and formed the Indian National Army to fight the British head-on. Between nationwide strikes and armed rebellion pushing from the borders, the Indian people rescinded Britain's right to govern them. The Raj was paralyzed. When World War II finally ended, the British Empire was financially ruined. At the same time, they faced an Indian subcontinent that had become a singular, non-cooperative front. The collapse of British enforcement power became obvious during the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny of 1946. Indian sailors revolted against their officers, proving to London that the colonial military could no longer be trusted to suppress its own people. With no economic leverage and no military enforcement left, the British were forced to leave. In 1947, Lord Mountbatten oversaw the transfer of power, officially partitioning the subcontinent and ending the British Raj. India's sovereignty was an inevitable concession, forced by a nation that had made itself impossible to exploit.